On the evening of March 27, 1943, Margarete Hoffmann stood in her Hamburg apartment, 3 stories above the Altstadt district, watching the sunset paint the Elbe River in shades of amber and gold. The spring air carried the scent of bread from the bakery below, and her daughter Anna practiced piano in the next room, filling their home with Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata. For a moment, Margarete allowed herself to believe that life could return to normal, that the rumors of massive air operations were exaggerated, that surely the worst had passed. She could not have been more catastrophically wrong. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you are watching from. It really helps support the channel. What Margarete and millions of German civilians would discover over the coming months was that terror had 2 distinct faces in the skies above their cities, and while both brought devastation, one carried a psychological weight that made sleep itself become an enemy, transformed darkness into a realm of unspeakable dread, and turned every sunset into a countdown to potential annihilation. This is the story of why, given the choice between the methodical precision of American daylight operations and the approaching darkness heralded by British night raids, German civilians overwhelmingly feared the latter with a primal intensity that statistics alone could never capture. The transformation in civilian perception did not happen overnight, nor was it immediately obvious to outside observers. In early 1942, when American forces joined the air campaign over Europe, German propaganda eagerly reported each daylight raid, showcasing the formations of flying fortresses caught in searchlight beams, emphasizing the targets hit, the industrial facilities damaged. The Luftwaffe's defensive fighter wings claimed impressive numbers, and civilians watching from their windows or shelters could see the spectacle unfold above them in clear daylight, the contrails marking paths across blue sky, the occasional parachute blossoming white against clouds, the smoke rising from specific, identifiable locations. There was something almost comprehensible about this form of attack, something that fit within the parameters of conventional military operations that the human mind could process and categorize. Helga Schneider, a factory worker from Essen, kept a meticulous diary throughout the conflict years, and her entries from this period reveal the initial civilian response to American daylight operations. On June 15, 1942, she wrote about watching a formation of 17 American bombers pass directly over her neighborhood at 22,000 feet, their contrails forming parallel lines across the afternoon sky. She described how the air raid sirens gave ample warning, how she and her co-workers filed into the factory's reinforced basement, how they could hear the distant crump of explosions from the Krupp works 3 kilometers away, and how, after 45 minutes, the all clear sounded and they returned to their stations. Her entry concluded with a sentence that would be impossible to imagine just 18 months later. She wrote that while frightening, the experience felt no different than a severe thunderstorm, a natural event to be weathered and survived. The American strategic bombing doctrine, developed by theorists at the Air Corps Tactical School throughout the 1930s, emphasized precision attacks against specific industrial and military targets. The Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress, with its Norden bomb sight and capability to operate at altitudes above 25,000 feet, represented the technological embodiment of this philosophy. Each aircraft carried approximately 4,000 to 6,000 pounds of ordnance, carefully calculated for specific target sets. A typical American mission involved formations of 30 to 100 bombers, flying in tight defensive boxes, approaching targets in broad daylight when visibility allowed precise identification and targeting. The crews trained extensively in formation, flying and bombing procedures, with bombardiers spending hundreds of hours learning to use their sophisticated sighting equipment. For German civilians, this translated into a predictable pattern. American raids typically occurred between 10 in the morning and 4 in the afternoon, when weather conditions provided optimal visibility. The formations announced themselves hours in advance, first detected by coastal radar stations, then tracked across occupied territories, giving German cities substantial warning time. Air raid sirens would sound when enemy formations were still 60 to 90 minutes away from their targets. This advance notice allowed civilians to reach designated shelters, gather essential items, and prepare psychologically for the coming attack. Factory workers moved to basement shelters, families descended into cellars, and civil defense personnel took their positions at predetermined stations. Werner Hoffmann, who served as an air raid warden in Schweinfurt during 1943, later described the American attacks as exercises in grim professionalism. He recalled how his responsibilities during daylight raids followed a clear protocol: ensure all civilians reached shelters, verify that incendiary response teams were positioned, coordinate with emergency services, and maintain communications with the district command post. The raids themselves, while terrifying and destructive, followed patterns that trained personnel could anticipate and respond to. American formations targeted specific industrial facilities, with bombs designed to penetrate structures and destroy machinery. The psychological impact, while severe, operated within parameters that human psychology could process through familiar frameworks of military conflict and industrial warfare. The contrast with British night operations emerged from fundamentally different strategic philosophies and tactical capabilities. The Royal Air Force, particularly after Air Marshal Arthur Harris assumed command of Bomber Command in February 1942, pursued what became known as area bombing, a doctrine that explicitly targeted entire urban centers rather than specific military installations. The reasoning behind this approach combined practical limitations. British bombers found precision attacks at night technically impossible with existing navigation equipment. With strategic calculation, destroying urban infrastructure would undermine industrial production and civilian morale more effectively than attempting pinpoint strikes on individual factories. The technological capabilities of British bomber forces reflected these priorities. The Avro Lancaster, which became the backbone of Bomber Command operations, could carry extraordinary payloads, up to 14,000 pounds of mixed ordnance, compared to the lighter loads carried by American aircraft. More significantly, British operational doctrine emphasized creating maximum destructive effect through coordinated waves of different bomb types. A typical major raid began with Pathfinder aircraft dropping incendiary markers over target zones, followed by waves of bombers carrying a calculated mixture of high explosive and incendiary weapons designed to create firestorms, self-sustaining conflagrations that generated their own weather patterns and consumed entire city districts. The psychological impact on German civilians began with the timing itself. British bombers operated almost exclusively at night, exploiting darkness as both protection from defensive fighters and as a weapon of psychological warfare. The sound of air raid sirens after sunset carried entirely different emotional weight than the same warning during daylight hours. Margaret Hoffmann, whose apartment overlooked Hamburg, described in a letter to her sister how the evening sirens triggered physical responses that daylight alerts never produced. Her hands would begin trembling before conscious thought registered the meaning of the sound. Her daughter would start crying even before fully waking, and her elderly mother would begin praying in the same desperate whisper that marked every nighttime alarm. The acoustic landscape of British night operations amplified this psychological dimension exponentially. German civilians learned to distinguish the distinctive asynchronous drone of British bomber engines, particularly the 4 Rolls-Royce Merlin engines of the Lancaster, which produced a sound one survivor described as the breathing of mechanical dragons. Unlike the high-altitude Americans, whose engine noise remained relatively distant, British bombers operated at lower altitudes, typically 10,000 to 15,000 feet, bringing that sound much closer, making it feel immediate and personal. The darkness transformed sound into something more visceral than information. It became texture, pressure, presence. Klaus Becker, a 17-year-old student in Dresden during 1944, kept an audio diary, recording his observations onto a wire recorder his father had acquired before the conflict. His recordings from October through December capture the sensory reality of British night operations with chilling clarity. In one entry from November 9th, he describes lying in his basement shelter, listening as the approaching formation's engine noise builds from a barely perceptible hum to an overwhelming roar that seems to compress the very air. He mentions how impossible it becomes to judge distance or direction, how the sound appears to come from everywhere simultaneously, how it penetrates not just ears, but seems to resonate in chest cavities and make the ground itself vibrate. The bombing patterns themselves created additional layers of psychological torment. British operations typically unfolded over hours rather than the concentrated 30 to 45-minute duration of American raids. A major British attack involved multiple waves arriving at intervals, with pathfinders marking targets followed by main bomber streams, then additional waves reinforcing the attack. For civilians huddled in shelters, this meant periods of intense bombardment punctuated by brief respites that never brought certainty that the attack had ended. Each pause created agonizing questions. Was it over? Should they remain in shelters or risk emerging to fight fires? Would another wave arrive as soon as they left protection? Ursula Schmidt, a nurse in Bremen, described in testimony recorded for Allied investigators after the conflict how the extended duration of night attacks created unique psychological pressures. During American daylight raids, she could work throughout the attack, treating injuries in the hospital's basement casualty station, maintaining focus through activity and purpose. British night operations stripped away that coping mechanism. The hospital's emergency protocols required all non-essential personnel to remain in deepest basement shelters during night raids, meaning medical staff sat in darkness for hours, unable to help or act, while the building shook from nearby impacts and they listened to the screams of patients trapped in upper floors that could not be evacuated. The weapon effects themselves contributed profoundly to the psychological differential. American operations primarily employed high-explosive ordnance, general-purpose bombs ranging from 500 to 2,000 pounds, designed to destroy structures through blast effects. The resulting damage, while catastrophic, remained comprehensible within familiar frameworks. Buildings collapsed into rubble, craters marked impact points, structural damage could be assessed and classified. The aftermath of American raids presented scenarios that, however horrific, aligned with pre-existing mental categories of destruction drawn from earthquakes, industrial accidents, or conventional artillery bombardment. British incendiary attacks created something qualitatively different, something that violated fundamental assumptions about the behavior of the physical world and pushed human psychology into territories it had not evolved to process. The mixture of high explosive and incendiary weapons was carefully calculated to maximize destructive synergy. Initial high explosive bombs shattered windows, collapsed roofs, and broke water mains, creating ideal conditions for incendiary weapons to start multiple simultaneous fires that emergency services could not contain. The incendiaries themselves came in several types: 4-pound magnesium thermite devices that burned at temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees Celsius, larger phosphorus bombs that created spreading pools of fire that reignited after being extinguished, and specialized devices designed to penetrate building roofs before igniting interior structures. The psychological impact of fire as a weapon exceeded all other forms of aerial bombardment by orders of magnitude. Margaret Hoffman, who survived the Hamburg firestorm attacks of late July 1943, spent 3 years after the conflict's end unable to describe her experiences in coherent narrative form. When American military historians interviewed her in 1946, she could only repeat certain phrases. The air itself was burning, fire moved like water. The wind pulled children from their mother's arms. Other survivors used similar metaphors that struggled to capture sensory realities for which human language had no adequate vocabulary. Fire tornadoes, created when multiple blazes merged into single firestorms, generated winds exceeding 150 kilometers per hour that uprooted trees and lifted automobiles. The thermal updrafts created weather systems visible from hundreds of kilometers away, mushroom clouds that resembled those later associated with atomic weapons. The Hamburg attacks, codenamed Operation Gomorrah by British planners, represented the perfection of night area bombing doctrine and created a before and after moment in German civilian consciousness regarding air raids. Beginning on the night of July 24, 1943, British forces launched 4 massive night raids over 10 days, with American forces conducting 2 daylight operations between the British strikes. The British night attacks dropped approximately 8,800 tons of ordnance, 3/4 of which consisted of incendiary weapons, while the American daylight operations dropped approximately 1,300 tons of predominantly high-explosive bombs targeting port facilities and U-boat construction yards. The casualty and damage statistics reveal the asymmetry starkly. The British night operations produced approximately 37,000 confirmed civilian fatalities, with an additional 50,000 to 80,000 injuries requiring hospital treatment. The American daylight strikes resulted in approximately 2,300 civilian deaths. The physical destruction showed similar proportions. British incendiary attacks consumed approximately 16 square kilometers of Hamburg's urban core, destroying or making uninhabitable over 277,000 residential units. American precision strikes damaged or destroyed approximately 44 specific industrial facilities with minimal surrounding structural damage. Gustav Richter, who commanded a fire brigade in Hamburg's Hammerbrook district, provided testimony to British investigators in 1947 that illuminated the qualitative differences between raid types from a professional responder's perspective. He explained that American attacks, while dangerous, presented scenarios his training and equipment could address. High explosive bomb damage created discrete incident locations that teams could approach, assess, and process according to established emergency protocols. Fires from American operations typically involved individual structures ignited by explosive impacts, manageable through coordinated firefighting efforts once the raid concluded. British night incendiary operations created conditions that made professional emergency response impossible. Richter described the night of July 27, 1943, when his brigade responded to initial fires in their district following the first incendiary wave. Within 30 minutes, separate building fires merged into a district-wide conflagration, generating hurricane-force winds that prevented firefighting teams from approaching within 200 meters of affected areas. The thermal currents lifted burning debris thousands of meters into the air, creating cascading secondary fires across entire neighborhoods. Water mains shattered by high explosive weapons meant hydrants produced no pressure, even where they remained accessible. Richter's brigade retreated to designated fallback positions and could only watch as 73 city blocks burned completely, incinerating everything within them, including over 16,000 civilians who had sheltered in basement structures that became ovens when fire consumed the buildings above them. The psychological distinction between American and British operations manifested most clearly in civilian behavioral patterns, as documented by German civil defense authorities. After American daylight raids, typical civilian response involved a relatively rapid return to normalcy. People emerged from shelters within 1 to 2 hours after the all-clear assessed damage, retrieved possessions from damaged homes, reported to workstations, and resumed daily routines within 24 to 48 hours. Psychological services reported elevated anxiety levels for several days following major daylight attacks, but clinical presentations involved symptoms recognizable from other traumatic experiences, difficulty concentrating, hypervigilance regarding air raid warnings, nightmares featuring specific traumatic moments. British night attacks produced fundamentally different psychological aftermath patterns. Hamburg authorities reported that 3 days after the July 27th firestorm, fewer than 30% of residents whose homes remained structurally intact had returned to their neighborhoods. Emergency services documented thousands of individuals discovered wandering major roads leading out of the city, often without possessions, sometimes without shoes, walking simply to achieve distance from the affected area. Temporary shelters established for bombed-out residents recorded occupancy rates far below the number of displaced persons, indicating large populations who refused to remain within the city limits even when provided housing. Psychological casualties presenting at medical facilities described symptoms that physicians struggled to categorize: complete inability to sleep in darkness, violent panic responses to any mechanical rumbling sounds, refusal to remain in enclosed spaces even briefly, near catatonic dissociative states lasting days or weeks. The differential extended into long-term sociological impacts measurable through civilian behavior patterns. Industrial production statistics reveal striking patterns when correlated with raid types. Factories hit by American precision attacks typically returned to partial production within 2 to 6 weeks, with workers reporting for shifts, management coordinating repairs, and supply chains gradually reconstituting. British area bombing produced more complex patterns. Even facilities that sustained minimal direct damage experienced prolonged production interruptions because workforce populations had scattered beyond the city limits, were unable to function normally due to psychological trauma, or simply refused to remain in urban centers that had experienced major night incendiary attacks. Annalisa Weber, who worked as a personnel administrator for an electrical manufacturing firm in Cologne, documented the workforce impact of different raid types in company records, later examined by Allied economic analysts. Following a major American precision strike on April 17, 1944 that damaged 60% of the facility's floor space, the company reported 84% of employees reporting for work at temporary locations within 1 week and 93% within 3 weeks. A British area attack 6 weeks later that left the facility's remaining structures largely intact, but consumed residential neighborhoods where employees lived, resulted in employee availability dropping to 41% after 1 week and only recovering to 78% after 3 months. The cumulative psychological exhaustion created by recurring night operations emerged as perhaps the most insidious dimension of British bombing's civilian impact. Human sleep psychology requires darkness for normal restorative rest, but British operations transformed darkness from a biological necessity into a source of existential threat. Air raid warnings typically began sounding shortly after sunset and continued intermittently throughout the night, even when raids did not materialize. German civilians faced an impossible choice: attempt to sleep despite the possibility of sudden attack requiring immediate evacuation to shelters, or remain awake throughout darkness waiting for alarms, guaranteeing chronic sleep deprivation. Hilse Kohler, a physician specializing in nervous disorders who maintained a practice in Frankfurt throughout 1943 and 1944, documented the progressive deterioration of civilian psychological resilience under sustained night bombing in medical case files later studied by researchers. Her notes describe how patients initially presented with acute anxiety responses to specific raids, but over months of recurring night operations, the symptom profiles shifted toward chronic conditions resembling those seen in extended combat exposure: persistent hypervigilance, inability to experience moments of relaxation or safety, progressive emotional numbing, and gradual withdrawal from social connections. She noted that American daylight operations rarely produced similar chronic presentations. Patients experienced acute reactions but recovered baseline functioning relatively quickly. The strategic logic underlying British area bombing explicitly incorporated civilian psychological impact as a central objective. Air Marshal Harris and other Bomber Command architects argued that undermining civilian morale would reduce industrial productivity more effectively than attempting to destroy specific factories. German civilians represented not merely collateral concerns, but primary targets, with the specific goal being to make urban residents psychologically untenable. The use of incendiary weapons, the timing of night operations, and the focus on residential districts all reflected calculated efforts to maximize civilian psychological impact. German authorities responded to the growing crisis of civilian morale with increasing desperation as the conflict progressed. Propaganda efforts attempted to maintain resolve by emphasizing the military's defensive achievements, the courage of air raid response personnel, and promises of retaliation through wonder weapons under development. These efforts achieved limited success against the accumulating weight of personal experience. Otto Hartmann, who worked in the propaganda ministry's domestic morale section, later admitted in testimony that internal ministry assessments by late 1943 acknowledged that civilians distinguished sharply between American and British operations, and that while official pronouncements treated both equally, the population overwhelmingly feared British night attacks with intensity that propaganda could neither explain away nor successfully redirect. The physical urban geography of German cities reinforced the differential psychological impact. Most major industrial centers featured high-density residential architecture with narrow streets and closely spaced buildings, urban patterns that had evolved over centuries but proved catastrophically vulnerable to incendiary attack. British weapons designers and targeting specialists explicitly exploited these vulnerabilities, calculating the exact mixture of high explosive and incendiary bombs required to guarantee fire spread between structures. American precision operations targeting specific factories caused localized destruction, but left surrounding neighborhoods largely intact. British area attacks treated entire urban zones as single targets, with success measured by the total area consumed rather than specific facilities destroyed. The experiences of children amplified the psychological toll exponentially, creating trauma that would echo through generations. Gabriele Schneider, interviewed as an elderly woman in 1998 about her childhood in Stuttgart, described how she and other children developed elaborate superstitious rituals around British night raids. She recalled how she would arrange her dolls in specific patterns in the shelter, believing this protected her family, how she refused to wear certain clothing items because she had worn them during particularly terrifying attacks, and how even 60 years later, she could not sleep in complete darkness without experiencing severe anxiety. American daylight raids, while frightening, did not produce the same ritualistic responses or long-term psychological scarring. The differential fear manifested in civilian decision-making regarding evacuation and internal movement. German authorities established voluntary evacuation programs, allowing urban residents to relocate to rural areas, with priority given to families with young children. Internal movement statistics reveal striking patterns. Cities experiencing primarily American precision attacks saw evacuation rates of 15 to 25%, with evacuees often maintaining regular contact with urban residences and returning periodically. Cities subjected to major British area attacks experienced evacuation rates exceeding 50%, with evacuees rarely returning even for brief visits and often refusing to re-enter city limits under any circumstances. Hamburg recorded evacuation rates approaching 70% in the months following Operation Gomorrah, with the city's population not recovering pre-attack levels until years after the conflict's conclusion. The acoustic dimensions of British night operations deserve particular emphasis because sound operates differently in darkness, becoming more salient, more emotionally charged, more fundamentally threatening when visual information is unavailable. The specific sounds of British raids, the asynchronous engine drone approaching from darkness, the whistle of falling bombs that provided no visual warning, the roar of spreading fires, the screams of neighbors trapped in burning buildings, combined into a sensory environment that could not be mentally prepared for or defended against. Erika Müller, a professional musician before the conflict who survived multiple Hamburg attacks, described how her absolute pitch became a curse during night raids, as she could precisely identify the frequencies of falling bombs and estimate their likely impact points based purely on the whistling tones, creating seconds of mathematical certainty regarding potential imminent annihilation. The religious and existential dimensions of night attacks created additional layers of psychological burden. Multiple survivors' accounts reference the feeling that British incendiary attacks represented something outside the normal categories of warfare, something that felt apocalyptic, biblical, like divine judgment manifested in pillars of fire visible from 50 kilometers away. American daylight operations, however destructive, remained categorizable as military actions conducted by identifiable aircraft against strategic targets. British night attacks felt less like military operations than natural disasters or supernatural events, unstoppable forces that human agency could neither predict nor meaningfully resist. The transformation in civilian perception was not universal or absolute. Individuals responded differently based on personality, prior experiences, and specific circumstances. Some civilians retained rational frameworks, emphasizing the strategic necessity driving both Allied bombing campaigns. However, the aggregate pattern remained unmistakable. When given opportunities to express preferences, whether through evacuation decisions, work attendance patterns, or psychological service presentations, German civilians demonstrated overwhelming fear of British night operations that exceeded their anxiety regarding American daylight attacks by orders of magnitude. Franz Zimmermann, a Lutheran pastor in Darmstadt, who maintained detailed records of conversations with parishioners throughout 1943 and 1944, documented the evolution of civilian attitudes through their questions and concerns. In early 1943, parishioners expressed relatively balanced fears regarding both American and British operations, focusing primarily on the physical threat to infrastructure and the general danger of aerial bombardment. By mid-1944, after Darmstadt experienced several British area attacks, Zimmermann's records indicate that over 90% of pastoral consultations involving air raid fears specifically referenced British night operations, with American daylight attacks rarely mentioned, except as contrasting examples of more bearable forms of bombardment. The medical infrastructure documented the differential through injury patterns and casualty characteristics. American precision attacks produced casualties consistent with conventional high-explosive weapons, blast injuries, structural collapse trauma, fragmentation wounds from shrapnel. Treating physicians could apply standard emergency medicine protocols with reasonable effectiveness. British incendiary attacks generated casualty profiles that overwhelmed medical capabilities. Massive numbers of severe burn injuries, requiring specialized treatment unavailable in sufficient quantity. Smoke inhalation damage in populations exposed to toxic combustion products from burning urban materials. And psychological casualties, presenting with symptoms beyond the training of available psychiatric personnel. Dr. Heinrich Bauer, who directed a major trauma facility in Essen throughout 1943 and 1944, testified after the conflict regarding the qualitative differences in treating casualties from different raid types. He described how American raid casualties, while numerous and severe, fell within parameters his staff could effectively triage and treat. British incendiary casualties often arrived in such quantities and with such severe presentations that meaningful medical intervention became impossible. He recounted nights when the facility received over 300 severe burn cases within 2-hour periods, completely exceeding available surgical capacity and forcing staff into makeshift triage decisions that amounted to choosing who would receive treatment and who would be provided only palliative care while awaiting death. The propaganda dimension further amplified civilian fears regarding British night operations. German domestic media coverage emphasized British incendiary attacks as evidence of Allied barbarity and disregard for civilian life, while framing American precision attacks as militarily legitimate, even if regrettable. This distinction reflected the regime's recognition that civilians already perceived the operations differently. Propaganda merely reinforced existing emotional responses rather than creating them. The narrative framework provided civilians with language to articulate fears they already felt viscerally, describing British night attacks as terror bombing campaigns deliberately targeting women and children, while characterizing American daylight operations as unfortunate military necessities. The physical shelter infrastructure illustrated official recognition of the operational differences. Basement shelters adequate for surviving conventional high-explosive attack offered little protection against sustained incendiary operations that consumed entire buildings. Cities subjected to repeated British attacks constructed specialized deep bunker systems with sophisticated ventilation to prevent smoke infiltration and structural designs capable of surviving surface temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees. These facilities, requiring enormous resource investments, existed primarily in cities that experienced major British area attacks. Cities facing predominantly American precision attacks often maintained simpler basement shelter systems, adequate for protection against blast effects, but not extended exposure to fire conditions. The cumulative effect across the German civilian population created a collective trauma whose psychological impacts persisted long after the conflict's conclusion. Post-conflict psychiatric research documented extraordinarily high rates of what later generations would recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder among civilians who experienced British area bombing campaigns, with symptoms persisting decades after the events. American precision attacks, while certainly traumatic, produced markedly lower rates of chronic psychological conditions. The differential suggested something fundamental about how human psychology processes different forms of threat and trauma. By the time Allied ground forces advanced into German territory in early 1945, the distinction between American and British operations had become so deeply embedded in civilian consciousness that even official pronouncements could not modify the perception. Surrender negotiations in numerous cities included specific requests from German authorities regarding protection from further British night attacks, while American daylight operations were accepted as inevitable continuation of military operations. This differential fear persisted into the occupation period, with German civilians expressing greater anxiety about potential British administrative authority than American governance, a prejudice rooted directly in the psychological legacy of bombing operations. The strategic effectiveness of the two approaches remains debated among military historians, but the differential psychological impact admits no debate. British night incendiary operations succeeded brilliantly in making urban residents psychologically untenable for German civilians, creating terror that exceeded rational calculation of actual danger probabilities. American precision attacks, while militarily effective against specific targets, never generated comparable psychological dislocation. The distinction reflected fundamental aspects of human psychology regarding darkness, fire, and the illusion of control. Margaret Hoffmann survived the conflict, evacuating with her daughter to a village 90 kilometers from Hamburg after Operation Gomorrah. She never returned to the city, despite her family's roots there extending back 7 generations. In interviews conducted in 1963, she stated that she still could not face sunset without feeling her chest tighten, that she kept every light in her rural cottage burning from dusk until dawn, that she had never managed to explain to her daughter why they could never visit the rebuilt Hamburg. When asked specifically about American daylight raids versus British night operations, she paused for a long moment before answering that the Americans brought war, which was terrible but comprehensible. The British, she said quietly, brought something else, something that felt like the ending of the world itself, something that even 20 years later invaded her dreams and made her wake gasping, convinced she could smell smoke. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Do not forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.